The village of Hawthorne Vale lay wrapped in December's gentlest deceit frost, dusted hedgerows, smoke curling from cottage chimneys, and church bells practicing hymns that promised peace while concealing human frailty beneath their sound. Christmas was nearly upon them, and the village wore its best manners like freshly pressed wool. At the edge of the green stood Greystone Manor, an imposing yet kindly house of warm brick and ivy-clad stone. Its windows glowed with lamplight, and inside, the great drawing-room fire crackled merrily, as if eager to reassure all who entered that nothing dreadful could possibly occur in such a civilized place. Miss Jane Marple, bundled neatly in dove, grey tweed and a sensible felt hat, paused in the doorway to remove her gloves. She had arrived that afternoon at the invitation of her old friend Dorothy Bantry, who was staying at the Manor for the holiday. Miss Marple approved of Christmas visits. They allowed one to observe people under strain, which was always revealing. The host of Greystone Manor, Colonel Alistair Whitcomb, greeted her warmly. A tall man with a military stoop and an expression permanently balanced between courtesy and command, he prided himself on tradition. "We'll do things properly here," he said, gesturing towards the fire. "Family, old friends, and a decent Christmas." Miss Marple smiled. She had heard that phrase many times before, usually just before someone behaved very badly indeed. The house guests formed a curious little gathering. Harold Whitcomb, the Colonel's nephew, recently returned from London with ambitions far exceeding his means. Evelyn Price, the Colonel's secretary, precise and quietly observant. Dr. Leonard Fry, the village physician, genial but prone to evasive humour. Margaret Bell, a distant cousin, brittle with disappointment and too much sherry. And lastly, Stanley Moore, a business associate of the Colonel's, whose charm was worn thin at the edges. The evening passed with tea, restrained conversation, and the comforting rituals of the season. Yet Miss Marple, knitting calmly by the fire, noticed the tiny fractures beneath the surface. Harold's resentment when money was mentioned, Margaret's sharp glances at Evelyn, Dr. Fry's unease whenever Stanley spoke, and Stanley himself, restless, watching the Colonel as a chess player watches an opponent. Later that night, as the household prepared for supper, Stanley Moore excused himself to warm by the fire. Moments later, a scream shattered the calm. They found him slumped in the high-backed chair, one hand hanging limp, the other still clutching a glass of mulled wine. The fire burned low beside him, festive lights blinking mockingly on the mantel. Dr. Fry knelt and examined him briefly. "I'm afraid he's quite dead." Miss Marple looked into the fire and thought, yes, and not by accident. The police arrived swiftly, though discreetly. Inspector Collins, a practical man with a respect for village elders and little patience for Christmas disruptions, took charge. Initial impressions suggested a sudden heart failure. Stanley Moore was known to indulge, and the chair beside the fire seemed an obvious place for such an end. Yet Miss Marple noticed that the mulled wine glass had been refilled recently, and Stanley had already had one earlier. She mentioned this gently to Inspector Collins. "And you think that matters, Miss Marple?" "Well," she said pleasantly, "people are often most careless when they believe they are being kind." An autopsy was arranged, but in the meantime, the household remained under polite scrutiny. Miss Marple observed conversations over breakfast. Harold Whitcomb spoke bitterly of Stanley's business pressure. He had Uncle Alistair in a dreadful position financially. Margaret Bell hinted darkly at threats and raised voices the night before. He was not a nice man. Evelyn Price said very little, but her hands shook when tea was poured. Dr. Fry claimed he had been in his surgery all evening, until Miss Marple recalled seeing his bicycle by the manor gate shortly before dinner. The Colonel himself appeared genuinely shaken. "I trusted more," he said stiffly. "Perhaps I shouldn't have." Miss Marple listened more than she spoke. She watched how people avoided the chair by the fire, how Margaret suddenly drank less, how Evelyn never touched mulled wine again. That afternoon, she wandered into the drawing room alone. The fire had been cleaned, but faint stains remained on the hearth rug. Kneeling with some difficulty, she detected a faint scent, not smoke, not wine, bitter almonds. "Ah," thought Miss Marple, "that old story again." The coroner's preliminary findings unsettled the household. "There are traces of poison," Inspector Collins announced. "Likely introduced via the drink." Suspicion bloomed everywhere. Harold stood to inherit if the Connells' finances collapsed. Margaret despised Stanley for exposing a long-ago scandal. Evelyn had access to everything in the house, Dr. Fry had medical knowledge. Even the Colonel himself could not be entirely excluded. Miss Marple invited Evelyn Price for a walk in the frosty garden. "You're very loyal," Miss Marple said conversationally. Evelyn flushed.
"I only do my duty." "Yes,"
Miss Marple agreed. "That's often where trouble begins." Evelyn broke then, confessing that Stanley had been blackmailing the Colonel. Forged documents. Threats of exposure. Yet she insisted she had not harmed him. Later, Dr. Fry admitted that he had once prescribed Stanley medication that could have been fatal if misused. Margaret Bell, cornered, revealed she had been cut out of Stanley's will. Each confession muddied the waters, but Miss Marple felt closer to clarity. That evening, she noticed something curious. The Colonel avoided the fire entirely now. When Miss Marple asked him why, he replied too quickly. "It reminds me of death." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, Colonel," she thought. "It reminds you of truth." On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple requested that everyone gather in the drawing room. Inspector Collins raised an eyebrow. "You're sure, Miss Marple?"
"Oh yes,"
she said. "Quite sure?" She stood by the fireplace, knitting laid aside. "The poison," she began, "was introduced not in the wine, but on the rim of the glass. A substance requiring heat to activate fully." Dr. Fry stiffened. "Only someone who knew the fire would warm the glass sufficiently could plan that," Miss Marple continued. She turned to the Colonel. "You did not intend to kill Stanley Moore that night. You intended to frighten him, teach him a lesson." The Colonel's face crumpled. "But you miscalculated," she said kindly. "You used knowledge gained long ago, from army days, and when you realized what had happened, you froze like a child who has broken something precious." Inspector Collins moved forward. The Colonel nodded slowly. "I never meant. I only wanted him silent." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Intentions are rarely as innocent as we tell ourselves." The Colonel was taken away quietly, dignity intact. The village mourned, not loudly but thoughtfully. Christmas came nonetheless. Hawthorne Vale carried on. Miss Marple prepared to leave, her visit complete. Dorothy Bantry sighed. "You always see it, Jane." "How?" Miss Marple smiled, pulling on her gloves. "People are much the same everywhere," she said. "One only has to listen. And remember." The fire burned low at Greystone Manor once more. No corpse beside it now, only shadows. And Miss Marple went home, her knitting resumed, Christmas intact, order restored.